Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Tommy Greenwald.
And Charlie Greenwald.
Hi there. It's so good to talk to both of you guys today. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Now, to provide a little bit of background for the listeners, I met you at ALA when I was going around and that's the American Library Association conference. I saw you at a signing and your book looked so fantastic. And I talked with your publisher, Angus, for a while, all about what you guys have done with your careers and all about that whole publishing world and everything. And I'm so excited to have you two on finally.
We're excited to be here. You said it looked fantastic. Did you read it and decided that it was fantastic?
Yes, it was fantastic.
Oh, okay, good.
Absolutely. Can you tell me a bit about yourselves, though, and your book specifically?
I'll go first and quickly. I have been writing children's book. This is Tommy Greenwald, by the way. I had my first book come out in 2011. I started writing it probably in 2009. And I was already in my mid-40s by then. I've had a career as a writer of various things. I wrote a musical called John and Jen when I was around 30. And I have been writing ads and marketing materials for Broadway shows for about 25 years. But then I turned to children's literature mainly because my three sons, Charlie, Joe, and Jack, Charlie, who was here, of course, were not big readers, and it was a struggle to get them to read. And to finally, I turned to writing a book about a kid who doesn't like to read, thinking that they and people like them might enjoy a book like that. And that is how my Charlie Joe Jackson series came about. The first book was Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Not Reading. And that turned into a series, which turned into another series called CRIMEBITERS. And I've had a few more series since. And lately I've been writing sports books, some serious like Game Changer and some a little bit more humor-based, the Good Sports League series. And then it was time to tackle a new genre of children's books, early readers. And for that, I started talking to Charlie, who has always been a writer too, about writing a story about rescue dogs and rescue animals, because it's a subject that's near and dear to our hearts. And that's how this new book, The Rescues, Finding Home, has come about. And
that's fantastic.
I will turn it over to Charlie to tell a little bit of his side of the story.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely touched on certainly the way our book came together. The Rescues was born out of an idea that you had about two dogs who are named Moose and Bear. And
adorable, I have to say. Also, cutest names ever for dogs. I love it.
Yeah, I've met several. I don't know about you, Molly, but I've met quite a few dogs actually who are named Moose, and one or two who are named Bear. But I think it was your idea, Dad, that they were two dogs named Moose and Bear, and they thought they were a moose and a bear, and they were confused at the fact that nobody around them seemed to treat them like a moose and a bear, because they were in fact puppies. And then I think it kind of morphed into this story of them being a bonded pair at an animal shelter. And then there were layers added to that. And I think it ended up becoming this story where they get kind of rescued together by the same woman and then adjust to their new life outside of the shelter. And we broke it up into three chapters. And yeah, it was obviously my pleasure to write with my dad. He's very established in the industry. So, it was my joy to be brought along for the ride.
That is fabulous. Yeah, I did not grow up with dogs, but I grew up with cats who were a bonded pair. And so I love it. It hits close to home having that. You mentioned that rescue dogs are something important to both of you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I don't want to sound too kind of soapboxy about it, but I do believe that there are so many dogs that need homes in this country and in the world, that I love people who want to rescue dogs. Bred dogs are wonderful too, don't get me wrong, but my heart will always be with the shelter dog. And in fact, I recently said to somebody, one of my proudest moments as a parent was passing that particular principle onto my kids, because Charlie, as well as his two brothers, Joe and Jack, all have sheltered rescue dogs now. So we're a family of rescue dogs lovers, and I think we all believe, and Charlie can attest to this too, that they rescue us just as much as we rescue them.
Yeah, I would fully agree. And I would add two things to that. First of all, you said you grew up with cats, Molly. I love cats, rescue cats too. My wife is very allergic to cats, but I love all pets and all animals. But what I specifically love, as my dad said about rescue animals, is that the circumstances around getting a rescue pet quite often are they can be extreme or dire. For example, you're saving an animal from euthanasia, or you're helping out an animal shelter that is dealing with overcrowding. Here in New York, many of the animal shelters are dealing with overcrowding right now. They don't have enough space for the rescue dogs that they're taking in, and the rescue cats. And in fact, a lot of people who got pets during the pandemic are surrendering them again. So I've always had a soft spot for rescue pets, as my dad said, of all shapes and sizes. And growing up, part of the reason I wanted to write this story with my dad was, growing up, we had a dog named Moose. He was our first rescue dog. And obviously, one of the characters in this book is named Moose. And he was just the greatest dog in the world. And I always say to people, I took very acute and particular notice of the fact that I felt like my parents, but specifically my dad, were at their happiest or in their best mood when they were around the pets, when they were around our dogs growing up. And that has a profound impact on you as a child. It's like, okay, well, when is dad in his best mood? When is he happiest? When is he most playful and fun? And it's when we're hanging out with the dogs. So obviously, that impacts you as a child.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And that's something like across the board with pets that can be so healing, and especially when it is a rescue and it's like I get to help this animal, and this animal is also like helping me, and you can build this relationship with it.
Absolutely. Occasionally my kids would make fun of me and say that I prioritize the dogs over them. Not true, at least not entirely true.
Of course not. Yeah, no, totally. So when did you two know you wanted to write a book together? Maybe not this book, but just any book.
I can't say it's something that we have been talking about for years. It kind of did happen organically with this book. It's funny because we had the idea for the story, and we had the idea to turn it into either a picture book or an early reader, which it ended up being, kind of for that kind of 6 to 9 year old person, boy or girl, or someone who's becoming an independent reader for the first time. And it kind of, I had an agent, and I think I sent the idea to her after Charlie and I had been working on it for a little while. And she was so taken by it that she kind of encouraged us. This is Amy Flynn, who was our agent, and she encouraged us to finish it because she was like, we can actually get this published. And so Charlie and I kind of looked at each other and said, holy smokes, our kind of fun pet project, pardon the pun, could actually become a book. And we were so lucky to then ultimately hook up with Angus Killick at Red Comet Press, and his partner and colleague at Red Comet, Mike Ewan Killick, because I've been friends with them for years. Angus worked at Macmillan when I had books at Macmillan. Mike, his partner in life and at Red Comet, is in the Broadway business, and I knew him for years in the Broadway business. And so it was really kismet that the two of them would read this story, which I kind of sent to them on a whim, or Amy sent to them, and they were so taken by it too. And before we knew it, we had a publishing deal with them, and we were making a couple of books together. So it was never a grand plan. I think, Charlie, let me know what you think, but you probably agree that it was not so much a grand plan as it was a fortuitous series of circumstances that fell into place in this lovely way that led us to being able to make these books.
Yeah, I totally agree. You couldn't have said it
That's
better.
wonderful. Actually, you briefly mentioned the working with Broadway things and writing for the stage. I noticed in both of your websites. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Darryl, you go first.
Yeah, well, I mean, my dad actually has a fairly successful musical that he wrote called John and Jen, which he co-wrote with Andrew Lippo, which is done all over the world. It would debuted off Broadway in 1990, I don't know, 1995, in the 90s, and has been revived a few times in New York. And so he has a lot of experience writing a full-length musical, and one that was, I think very successful by all measures. A lot of people in the theater industry have heard of that musical and that show. And Andrew Lippo, of course, went on to write, The Addams Family and Big Fish on Broadway. So he's had a great career. I wrote a play in college, very different from what my dad wrote. I wrote a comedy with a very close friend of mine that was performed at my school, Emerson in Boston.
On a prestigious award.
And it won a prestigious award.
Oh, wow.
But I think you've never heard of it, Molly. But I can tell you that both he and I think, have always liked theater. My dad and I both share a love of several musicals and plays that we've seen together over the years. He's, of course, worked in theater. I acted a lot in high school and college, and then wrote that play. And, it's all storytelling, children's books or musicals or songwriting, which my dad has done a little bit of, and I've done a little bit of as well. It's all just finding different ways to tell interesting stories through different mediums. I think what's wonderful about children's books is it forces you to be really economical. These things are like 5 pages long on a Word document. And so every word is so precious. Whereas when you're going through, a play or a musical, it's 90, 100 pages. And so they're both intense in terms of fleshing out a story, but you really have to be very careful the way that you put messaging together when you're writing children's book stories, because it has to be simple and every word counts that much more.
Absolutely. It's almost like poetry with that, where you're really trying to
Yeah.
focus heavily on what each line means. Yeah.
I think poetry is a great comparison. It's very similar. Yeah, I think what you're saying, Molly, is that we're poets. Is that right?
Yes, that is what I am saying. And if you take one thing away from this, it is that both of you are poets, and all children's book authors are as well.
I wrote a book called Game Changer, which is a serious football book, and a lot of it takes place at the bedside of the main character who's in a coma, and people are kind of just talking to him, stream of consciousness, to him and about him, and everybody, when it came out, everybody called it a novel in verse, which I thought was so funny, because I'm like, I've never considered myself remotely a writer of anything poetic or poetry or in verse, but I guess if it was an unorthodox style of narrative, so it was classified as a novel in verse, and it made me feel very important.
Was that the one that you've also written books, Dad, in the epistolary format? Am I saying that word right? I'm sure I'm butchering it, but you've actually had a more experimental, approach to writing than you probably give yourself credit for, because some of your books are written they're all written in various perspectives. Some are in third person, others are in first person.
Yeah. Some
are more in letters, some factor in social media. So you've done a lot of cool experimenting with the way you write your books, which I always enjoy.
Thanks. Awesome. Lately, I've decided that you have to kind of write you have to kind of experiment with the narrative form a little bit to break through the clutter, because I think one reason Game Changer was successful is because it appealed to reluctant readers, because it was written in this quote unquote novel in verse style. it wasn't so dense. It was a little more user friendly. Same with the social media and the texts and the social posts and stuff like that. So part of it's to experiment with the forum, and the other part of it, honestly, is because kind of from a marketing perspective, I think doing something different can get you a little more notice than you might otherwise get, because the field is very crowded.
Absolutely. I think also, as a writer who has written in many different facets and like different types of writing,
Mhm.
it can also make it easier to get certain stories out. Because if you're looking at something and trying to mold it into one thing, if you picked up a novel and you're like, this will be a children's book that rhymes, and then you're
Yeah,
writing it and going, this is not supposed to rhyme. This is supposed to be told in another way. You have to kind of go with the flow and let yourself experiment and break out of that.
completely agree. I love the fact that you're 16 years old and you're saying things like, as someone who's tried writing in many forms, I'm like, you're 16. You should be watching cartoons.
I'm an old soul. I'm an old soul.
I hope I didn't out you as a 16-year-old. Is that
Oh, no,
okay?
no, no.
People on the podcast know that you're a child.
I don't keep it hidden. I have mentioned it before. I had an interview once where it was she was so amazing. We had a great time. And about a week later, I was at a con talking with her publisher. And the publisher had known me for a very long time, and I was 12 at the time. And she comes up to me and she's like, I talked to Sandy. What plug for the Sandy King Carpenter interview, which is there. Everyone should go read everything that she's done. But the publicist comes up to me and is like, I talked to Sandy and she loved your interview. I don't think she knows how old you are though. And I'm like, okay, well, how old did she think I was? 25.
Wait,
She,
was she looking at you during
she
the
was not
interview?
looking at me. She was just hearing my voice and fully
Oh,
thought 12-year-old me was 25.
that's incredible. I would like
So
to hear.
I've been
No,
getting
if I
it for
go
a while.
back and listen to that interview, it was when you were 12.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna go check it out and see if you sound 25.
I I I sound from my podcast started when I was 6, so I sound like a chipmunk for about 4 years, and then I sound uh, like I am a fully grown adult immediately after that point.
No, you do such a great job. It makes a compelling case to start young. Because you hone your craft.
Start podcasting at 6.
Exactly,
That's the
exactly.
takeaway.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Out of the sandbox and into the booth. The
Yeah.
Molly Southgate story.
Yeah.
But
Um
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Actually, yeah, well, to kind of get us back on track, can you tell me a bit about raising and being raised by a writer? What was that like growing up?
Carl.
I mean, my dad is uh, he's a great writer. He's a versatile writer. As I said, he not just in his books, which he's written in a bunch of different formats, but he's also a really great songwriter. A lot of people don't know this about my dad, shockingly, but he was a music major in college.
Oh,
And so that's what he studied pretty intensively for 4 years was percussion and I think also piano. And he plays both incredibly well at an incredibly high level. And when we were kids, he would like make up songs on the piano, one of which was called That's What I Did Today, where he would like play this. I don't even know how to describe it, kind of like a jazzy piano riff. And then he'd be like, sing about your day. And like we would sing along to the song that he would play. So he was just like a very creative person who was always coming up with ideas. And, I can tell you that neither my brothers nor I are math or science aficionados. And so I think probably what we pulled from our dad was a more humanities oriented approach to life. We value art, we value literature, we value cultural criticism. We all like to write, even if my brothers don't necessarily do it as much in their free time. And we realized that there's a great, not just cathartic element to telling people stories and coming up with stories and writing, but the power of words and how to get messaging across, which is obviously crucial in today's society where a lot of people, I think, communicate in emojis and memes and GIFs. I like to write how I'm feeling and choose different words because words are a lot of fun. And I think I got that from my dad.
That's awesome.
I think raising Charlie along with his two brothers who as he said they're all funny and they're all creative and they can all write really quite well. But Charlie always kind of had a little extra need and an extra gene to turn his writing into stuff for others. He used to make funny videos where he's a fantastic mimic and impressionist, and he would imitate George W. Bush and make these hilarious videos when he was in middle school that went all over town because they were so funny. And as he said, he wrote this hilarious play in college and subsequently another hilarious play also with his writing partner. And so I always assumed that of the three of them, one of them, Charlie, would be the one to kind of make a go of it as a writer. It's not for the faint of heart becoming a writer, especially if you want to make it your career, because like many things, it's extremely competitive and it's hard to break through. But it was clear to me from an early age that he was going to be the one of my three kids that would be willing to go there and to give it a shot and to see if the world would buy what he was selling. And from an early age, what he was selling was, I thought, creative enough and funny enough and special enough to deserve to be out there if he got his break. So I couldn't be happier that this is happening. I'm sure he'll write some more stuff. He's working on other stuff now on his own that I'm sure will also get out there too. But it's a fun moment and a great privilege for me to be able to help him get his first thing out there as a double act, because it's I think a big kick for both of us.
That is so beautiful. Thank you both for sharing that. I have a question for you, Tommy. Can you tell me a bit about how your background in music has influenced your writing? Do you think that it's changed the way that you write, having that structure?
It's a good question. The only thing I can say off the top of my head is that I've had some books in which I've written some songs as part of the story. There's been a couple of lead characters that have been songwriters. I wrote this book called Katie Friedman Gives Up Texting a number of years ago, in which this girl, Katie Friedman, who gives up her phone for a week and convinces 10 of her friends to give up their phones for a week just as a social experiment. She's a songwriter, and I've wrote a bunch of lyrics in that book in her voice. So my lyric writing has certainly found its way into a couple of my books for sure. I don't know if my music training has affected me so much, although I'm sure it's subliminal. As Charlie said, these are all different ways to tell stories. And I feel like every story has a 3-act structure, whether it's a 3-minute song or a 40,000 word book or a 3-chapter early reader like The Rescues is. And so I think developing a story and giving it the 3 acts, the beginning, the middle, and the end, is something that just comes with the territory, and it comes with my songs that I was writing as a 25-year-old and the books I'm writing today. So I feel like it's less about the notes and the melodies for me than it is about how all art forms are really about telling a story. And so it wasn't such a big leap from the songs I wrote. I wrote some country songs, I wrote some pop songs, but they all had real storytelling elements to them. In fact, when I was writing songs early on, I would play them for people and they would say to me, "You should write for the theater because these are story songs." And I wasn't a huge theater person back then. And it was kind of the influence of these reactions that led me to writing for the theater and writing this musical. So I've always done character-driven stuff, whether in music or in prose. So they're connected fairly intensely in that way.
That is so cool. You can really tell when you're listening to music and reading books, I think, especially since that makes sense now why you have things that are more written in verse and more with experimental bends to
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
So, what did your co-writing process actually look like when it got down to it and you were writing together?
My dad wrote the first chapter and then was kind of like, do you want to, you know, have a crack at the second chapter? And so if you read The Rescues, I think the first chapter is that kind of initial story of Moose and Bear, these two dogs who thought they were a moose and a bear, find out that they're not, have to come to terms with that, and then realize that, through their friendship, I guess, that they're kind of this bonded pair. And I think what we ended up doing was you wrote the first version of that story, and then I can't remember if it was Amy or if you and I came up with it, but somebody suggested that we set it in the shelter, in the rescue shelter. And then I wrote the second chapter, and then I'm pretty sure you wrote the third. And from that point on, it was just about whittling it down and addressing notes. But I think with chapter books, it's probably easier because you can just alternate as opposed to like, some other story, like a one-act play or something where it's like you have to collaborate with a writing partner on every line. What was nice about this is we kind of just, we took different sections.
Yeah, I don't know if it was quite as cut and dried as Charlie's describing in terms of I took this chapter, you took that chapter. I think probably we came up with the storylines for the second two chapters together because these early readers, and this is something we kind of learned with our agent's help, Amy, is that they have these three short little chapters, but each chapter is really a story unto itself and could actually stand alone if necessary. So we kind of would start them anew. And so I think we mapped out the plots of all three chapters together, except the first one was somewhat in place for this idea I had kicking around for a long time. And then I think we probably divided up the first drafts for sure. You wrote the first draft of the second chapter. I wrote the first draft of the third chapter. And then we started kind of swapping them back and forth and realizing we had a word count we had to meet. And then we would say, okay, you try to whittle down this chapter. You whittle down the chapter I wrote. I'll whittle down the chapter you wrote. So we could kind of trade them back and forth and put fresh eyes on things. And it became a lot more back and forth after the initial drafts, I think.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I like you were saying too, it's very different. I've had people on before that talk about writing chapter books and things like that together, and each process is so unique. I really want to talk about those illustrations because they are stunning. Where did you find the illustrator? Was that through your publisher or research that you did on your own?
It was through our publisher. They found and selected Shiho. We didn't really have anything to do with the process. We were just happy to have our book, out in the world. But we got really lucky because Shiho's illustrations are filled with life and they're funny and they're so sweet. And I love her style. So we just, hit the jackpot with her.
Yeah, Mike Ewan Killick, who is, as I said earlier, my former colleague in Broadway advertising, even before I was involved with children's literature, does, I think, a lot of the creative direction and art direction for Red Comet Press. And he is brilliant at finding illustrators and matching them to the right projects. I think he does a lot of research. He does a lot of digging. He found her portfolio. And at a certain point, I think they did show us some of her work and said, here's who we're thinking of illustrating the book. And Charlie and I, as Charlie said, we're delighted even with the work she did for other projects. But as delighted as we were, I don't think either of us could have imagined how much she would elevate the storytelling with her drawings and her building of the character with her expressions of these animals. And she puts in little jokes in the corner of a drawing that you might not even see the first time or the second time. She just Charlie described it perfectly. Her drawings are filled with life, and it's really been the perfect marriage, I think, of text and illustration, and we're very fortunate.
That's amazing. Well, I just have one last question for you today. What do you have coming up?
Charles?
I'll speak about myself first. I am working on a Halloween book that I've finished, and we're gonna pitch it again to a bunch of different publishers and see if anybody's interested in it. I've always loved Halloween growing up. It's so funny. I always talk about this with people. Like, I love Halloween. I don't love like super scary things, but I like a lot of what Halloween is about in terms
Halloween is the best holiday.
I agree.
Down.
I think I just chose it initially because I love fall, and I just love that time of year. I love the changing of seasons. I love apple pie. I love sweaters. And so I was like, what am I missing in this tapestry of autumn? Oh, of course, Halloween. I need to love Halloween. But I like how silly it is as a holiday. People that you love and respect get dressed up in the most ridiculous costumes and walk around and get candy. I mean, it's just at its core, it's a very fun holiday. So I'm trying to write this book about a character who loves Halloween but doesn't quite feel like Halloween loves him back. And so I'm excited to see where that goes. And then
Charles?
Huh?
Say the name of the character. And
it's about Jack-o'-lantern's brother, whose name is Jeff O'Lantern. And he, unlike his brother, is not scary. And so he's having a tough time fitting in on Halloween. So that story is basically written. I'm going to try and find a home for it. And then I'm writing another book in the middle of writing it now. This one's much more in its infancy, about a hammerhead shark who is a handyman, and he goes around fixing people's problems in the ocean. And one day he comes upon a problem that he can't solve, and he has an identity crisis. So I'm excited to see where those go, but delighted as of now to just have even one book out there in the world, The Rescues, which I wrote with my dad.
That's all fantastic. Thank you for sharing those too. Those sound like awesome books. I can't wait to read them when they come out.
I can't wait to see them out there in the world too. We do have a second book in the Rescues series too, that Shiho is in the middle of drawing right now. Charlie, remind me what the title of that book is again.
Best Day Ever.
Thank you. The Best Day Ever. It all takes place in one day. And it's hilarious. And if we're fortunate, and people respond to this first book and the second book, we would love to make more in the Rescues library, because these characters have been so much fun to write, and we want to keep going with them. I have a couple other books coming out. I have a book, the second book in my Good Sports League story comes out also this fall, called The Perfect Pitch. And it's a book about a girl softball player who's a great softball player, but she also loves performing and acting in the school play. And she's getting pressure from her softball coach and the people on her softball side to give up the acting and the performing, because they want all her time, because she's so good. They want it to become her full-time activity, even as a 10, 11-year-old, because that's what's happening in the world now. The kids these days are being asked to specialize in things at younger and younger ages, which I think is not great. Kids should do a lot of different things for as long as they can, because there'll always be time to work on a specific thing as they get older. But
absolutely,
the way the world is now, and parents trying to get every advantage for their kids, a lot of them think that the best way to get those advantages is to have them focus on one thing, but a lot of times that backfires. So that's this book here. I don't know if there's a video element of the podcast, but
there is not. But I'm glad I got to see it, because that's a very cool book cover.
Thank you. And then I'm working on another more serious sports book about a boy who has to deal with the fallout when his dad gets in a bad argument and a fight with an umpire at a baseball game. And that is about something that's also happening in youth sports now, which is that officials and umpires and referees are taking more and more abuse from coaches and parents and even kids in youth sports games, 9 and 10 and 11 and 12-year-old games, which is absurd when you think about it. These are things that should be done for fun. And the fact that tempers flare up and arguments and sometimes even physical altercations happen is something that just, I think, has to be addressed. And so I'm writing about it.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you both so much for coming on today. I had such a wonderful time talking to the two of you.
You're so welcome, Molly. And you are really an impressive, I don't even want to say young woman because you're still a girl. You're a teenager.
Oh.
But
well, thank you. That is very sweet of you.
I'm impressed by your poise and your ability to articulate your thoughts. Bodes well for the youngsters of this country if you're an example of what's out there. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you. It was wonderful to meet both of you too. I hope you all have the best of luck with all of your writing, and so many people will buy your book and everything. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Charlie Greenwald.
And I'm Tommy Greenwald.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The
end.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.